Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 379 of the Prancing Pony podcast, where it seems everybody is speaking Westron except us.
That's right, we're still clinging to our own languages, it seems. Folks, pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I'm James Tauber, the Sage of the South, and I'm here with the man of the West whose language has not been enriched or softened under any influence. Alan
What are you talking about? You got a problem? Come over here and say that to... No, I speak freely and carelessly, James, just like the hobbits. Folks, join us as we take a look at the languages of, well, just about everyone as we begin our two-part look at Appendix F of The Lord of the Rings on language and translation.
Language and translation in this economy?
Well played, sir.
Folks, no matter how you arrive, you're all welcome here in the common room. At the Prancing Pony podcast, we're reading and talking our way through Middle-earth with plenty of speculation and bad jokes along the way.
That's right. Now, we do love our deep dives into the lore, discussing our favorite themes, and a whole lot more.
But we try to keep it light and fun, like a couple of friends chatting at the pub. And we're glad you've joined us.
Indeed we are, and I'm sure you'll be glad you joined as well. But before we get to tonight's chapter discussion, it's time to step into the North Wing and visit with one of our listeners. Now, today we're bringing you another new installment of The North Wing. As you know, Barnum and Butterbur had a room or two in the North Wing at the Prancing Pony Inn, made special for hobbits. This is our place, made special for some of our listeners, to give us a chance to get to know them. Now, rooms at the North Wing are a bit hard to come by, so only our patrons at the Elrond's Honorarium and Círdan's contribution tiers are eligible. So if you'd like to be one of the next patrons to join us, be sure to check out patreon.com/prancingponypod. Now, we do have a waiting list for the North Wing right now, and tonight's guest can tell you he's been waiting quite a while, but we will get to them all soon, and we'll make room for more if necessary. But let's not delay any further, since we've already delayed many, many months. Let's welcome tonight's guest to the North Wing, Brad Highnote.
Absolute pleasure to be with you, Alan.
It is a pleasure to have you, Brad, and thanks again for just being so patient. We'll start out, and I'm sure you've heard these before since this is the 56th one recorded. I'm sure you've heard a few. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what do you do, but then what do your loved ones think of all this Tolkien stuff you're into? Do you get a lot of grief? Do they love it with you? That kind of thing.
Sure. I am a lifelong Massachusetts resident. I live now out on Cape Cod, which, if anybody knows their geography, it's the hook that sticks out of New England. I live about halfway out on that, in the town of Harwich. I work for one of our communities out here as the municipal assessor, so I'm the one who gets yelled at when everyone's tax bills go out.
I was going to say, not the most popular guy in town.
Sure, and it's unfortunate in a part of the country where properties sell for $1-2 million habitually, they can afford to pay it. So I don't get too worked up with them.
No.
I'm very happy here. I love it. This Tolkien stuff, I'm very lucky. I'm married to a woman who is not as into it as I am, but she loves the films, and she embraces it all the way when the library expands with Tolkien books after Tolkien book after Tolkien book. So
that's good. That's a very good thing right there.
Absolutely.
I love that. Well, then, of course, the question we ask everybody who comes to the Prancing Pony: when and how did you first discover Tolkien's works? And then tell us a little bit about what your experience was like and why you keep coming back.
Well, first exposure to Tolkien was a book fair in elementary school, where I came home with a copy of The Hobbit, an old paperback of it, and I read it and I loved it, and I read it again because the language was just so unlike anything else any probably elementary school student had ever read at that point. And I made my dad read it to me.
Oh, great.
And then I didn't return to Tolkien until college, when the films were on their way.
Oh, okay.
And then I said, I remember reading The Hobbit when I was little, and one of my roommates had read it. He said, you should read the books. So I did. And that just by the end of book one, I was in.
Hooked.
Absolutely. Because it was just such a draw in. At that point, my college, in my senior year of college, I had credits to burn to graduate. So I took a Tolkien course. They had a whole semester on Tolkien, and it was awful.
Oh no. Oh no.
The school was clearly just taking advantage of the popularity of the movies.
Oh yeah. The timing.
The professors were not prepared in the least for it.
Oh,
so it was terrible, which is why I just ended up, when you realize the breadth of what Christopher Tolkien put out into the world, I just started doing it myself. And since then, it's just been the journey.
And that's the thing. The journey just keeps on going, doesn't it?
It's just wonderful. Yeah.
And I take it that's the part that keeps you coming back.
Absolutely. And now as a father of a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old,
oh, lovely.
A night doesn't pass where my wife and I read to our son every night. And he, at the end of it, he wants you to sit there with him for a little while.
Oh, yeah.
And he'll look at me and say, Dada, tell me Bilbo Baggins. And I've got it down to a solid 7-minute read through of the Hobbit.
I love it. That's awesome.
It is. It's great. And the only thing I have to leave out is the spiders, because he does not like spiders. No, nothing too scary. He's fine with a giant dragon, but spiders, no, Dada, don't like spiders.
Well, that's the thing. A dragon is purely an imaginary creature. He sees spiders. So
sure.
It's a little too real. We'll give him a few years and you'll be reading the full version of it to him. That's exciting.
I can't wait. I'm going to be in front of the fireplace with the whole thing.
I remember reading The Hobbit to my son when he was almost 6, was about when I started with The Hobbit. Of course, he's 13 now, so we've read the rest, but that's a whole different story. Well, which is your favorite book in the Legendarium? Obviously, you've read a lot of them then if you've been reading History of Middle-earth, and why? And then if you have a favorite non-Legendarium book, which one is it?
So toss up again. Book 1 of the Lord of the Rings was just such a grabber, and then getting to book 5 in the Lord of the Rings, where these events just hit you one after the next.
Coming, yep.
And then with the ending, with the Eagles coming, just kind of is like, oh, what did I just go through here as a reader?
Yeah,
those are the part when I return to the Lord of the Rings. Those two always jump out at me, so I have to give it to both of them.
That's
non-legendarium. I will go back to under my college years again and say that I did take a great course on old literature, and they used part of Tolkien's old translation of Beowulf.
Oh,
and Beowulf was I really dug. I did Beowulf. I like,
and his translation's really interesting too. I mean, it's it's not the one that most people think of when they think of Beowulf. No. I think a lot of people today go to the Seamus Heaney translation, but there is a lot to be said for Tolkien's.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm just biased, but I just the Tolkien's is what I like.
I agree. Well, any Tolkien goals that you'd like to share? Maybe tracking down a special book for your collection because you kept talking about the expanding shelves, or maybe going to a moot, something like that.
Oh, moot would be wonderful. I think that's something I've broached that already with the missus and said, I know the PPP has done moots, and we're not too far from where Signum is.
Yeah,
I know moots are a doable thing. So if you guys have one in a fun part of the country, I may be able to swing it.
I hope so. I think that'd be a lot of fun. I'd like that.
Yep.
Well, we're going to go ahead and move into our lightning round of relatively quick questions and answers. I mean, it's the PPP. We all digress, so I'm not going to give you a hard time. Favorite scene or moment in the Legendarium? Try to narrow it down to one.
Favorite scene: Gandalf healing Theoden.
Oh, that's an excellent one. Who is your favorite first age elf?
Finrod.
Yes, right answer. I mean, there is no wrong answer unless it's Fëanor or or maybe Miglin. That would be the other really bad choice. But Finrod's a good one. Who's your favorite Hobbit?
Favorite Hobbit, I got to go with Merry.
Okay, I like that choice.
Merry strikes the balance of the silliness.
He does.
And the seriousness, I think. So,
yeah.
Also doesn't help that my daughter, I call her Mary.
Oh, that's cute.
Her name is Marissa, but we call her Mary.
That's fair. That's a good one.
Yeah.
All right. You get to choose between the Noldor or the Teleri to spend, an age with. Now, of course, the Noldor you're hanging out with are not Fëanor and his son. So these are good Noldor. Yep. Which group do you choose? Do you choose the fisherman or the craftsman? I choose the fisherman. I'm a Teleri all the way. Teleri. I kind of thought that might be the case, being out on the Cape. I don't know. It just struck me as Teleri. That's it. Where I'm sitting right now, 5 minutes in either direction, east, north or south, I'm on a beach with nothing but water in front of me. And I could not live any other way. So all right. The Teleri it is. I love that. Yes. All right. I don't know why I highlighted this question, because we always choose from 20 different questions, but here's yours, and it's not a fun one. What happened to the Entwives? They're gone. Yeah. They are sadly gone. Hopefully far into the east where maybe just no one knows where they are, but. So they're not all dead. They just disappeared. They're just gone. Okay. We can hold some hope that they're gone. As the professor would say, there are no tales that concern them at this point. That's a good point. All right. Well, those are some great answers. Thank you, Brad, and thanks for sticking around and being so patient to get on.
No,
I want I
my
appreciate
pleasure,
it.
Alan. Thank you so much for opening this up to us. This is
absolutely.
great.
It's been a lot of fun, and I hope to see you at a moot soon.
If not, we'll see each other in Lotro, I hope.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We're on Peregrine now for the server, for the kinship. Well, we have really enjoyed having you here in the North Wing, Brad, but it is time for us to head back to the common room to join the rest of the listeners. But thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you back at our next Questions After Nightfall, if not sooner. And now we will return, folks, to the podcast in progress.
Okay, let's get started with the first part of Appendix F. Alan, take it away.
All right, sir. The languages and peoples of the Third Age. The language represented in this history by English was the Westron, or common speech of the Westlands of Middle-earth in the Third Age. In the course of that age, it had become the native language of nearly all the speaking peoples, save the Elves, who dwelt within the bounds of the old kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. That is, along all the coasts from Umbar northward to the Bay of Forochel, and inland as far as the Misty Mountains and the Ephel Duath. It had also spread north up the Anduin, occupying the lands west of the river and east of the mountains as far as the Gladden Fields. At the time of the War of the Ring, at the end of the age, these were still its bounds as a native tongue, though large parts of Eriador were now deserted, and few men dwelt on the shores of the Anduin between the Gladden and Rauros. A few of the ancient wild men still lurked in the Druidan forest in Anorion, and in the hills of Dunland a remnant lingered of an old people, the former inhabitants of much of Gondor. These clung to their own languages, while in the plains of Rohan there dwelt now a northern people, the Rohirrim, who had come into that land some 500 years earlier. But the Westron was used as a second language of intercourse by all those who still retained a speech of their own, even by the Elves, not only in Arnor and Gondor, but throughout the Vales of Anduin, and eastward to the further eaves of Mirkwood. Even among the wild men and the Dunlendings who shunned other folk, there were some that could speak it, though brokenly.
So before we get too deep into this, we do want to point out that if you're really interested in this, you've got to look at Peoples of Middle-earth, where Christopher Tolkien lays out a very long and thorough discussion of the many texts that preceded the published version of Appendix F. So when we talked about the calendars a couple of episodes, we mentioned D1 and D2, and similarly there are plenty of drafts for Appendix F, and they're long too.
They are. It's a very long discussion, which is why we can't cover it completely in depth here. There was one version of it that was actually written as a foreword rather than an appendix that Christopher refers to as F with an asterisk.
And then F1 and F2 are the primary and fuller versions that Christopher illuminates in that volume of Home. But there's also F3 and F4 and 4 more texts that Christopher doesn't include, saying, for the purposes of this account, it is not necessary to describe them.
Well, for the purposes of this episode, it won't be necessary either. Just like with the calendars, Tolkien found himself very frustrated with the limitations of size. Christopher writing, "Even if my father had not said so very plainly himself in his letters, it would be very evident from these drafts that the writing of an account that would satisfy him was exceedingly tasking and frustrating, largely, I believe, because he found the constraint of space profoundly uncongenial." Love that phrase.
And it also, it makes me think of all the stuff that we're now able to do digitally
as
well without those constraints.
I know, without the limitations of space in a physical medium.
Exactly. But we will, where possible, and as time allows in this episode, bring in information from F star, F1 and F2, maybe some of the other bits and bobs. But for those interested in the deep, deep dive, do be sure to check out that part of Peoples of Middle-earth.
Absolutely. Now there, Christopher publishes the full version of F2 and then records in his notes the differences from F1 because Tolkien otherwise followed F1 pretty closely.
And Christopher adds, in general, I treat F2 as the representative text of the original version and only distinguish F1 when necessary.
The funny thing about this, and I remember thinking about this as I was writing the outline for the episode, is I'm a huge F1 fan. So every time he was referencing F1, my brain would be like,
you got excited.
I can't help it, folks. I'm sorry. Now, looking at the text here, actual Appendix F, it is interesting that we get a description first of the role and even the reach of Westron, but not the nature of the language itself. And we'll get there, don't worry. But Tolkien begins by simply explaining that English in the story is meant as a translation of Westron, what he calls the common speech.
Saying it had, over the course of the Third Age, become the native language of just about everyone in the part of the world where the story takes place. And I just want to point out as well, he uses the term history. In this history.
Yes. Once again, the sort of this idea of a frame narrative being an actual history, the conceit of that.
But it's an interesting geographic spread, reminding us, of course, that lands like Harad and Hrun would not have received Westron as their, quote, native language.
Right, exactly. Now, this is the case, the geographic spread, even though a lot of those Western regions are now completely empty of people. I mean, Eriador, ever since, the plague wiped out a bunch of people, really thinned the population. But then when Arnor collapsed into the three petty kingdoms and then they all got wiped out, there's just not a lot of folks in these regions. And yet that's still the language of people that are in there.
Yeah. We get a mention of the Druidine, the ancient wild men, as well as the Dunlendings, along with a reminder that the Dunlendings were the original, or at least former inhabitants of the land of Gondor. Oh,
that is going to be an interesting thing to talk about next season. Folks, I'm really looking forward to exploring this whole idea of, the Dunlendings being displaced and sort of the original inhabitants of the land dealing with the Numenor imperial expansion. So we're going to be talking about that as we get into the story of Aldarion and Arendis, because Aldarion, of course, was largely responsible for some of the early expansion of Numenor. But we're going to look especially at the tale of Tal Elmar, but that's next season. Anyway, not surprisingly, those folks, and I can't blame them, they don't want to speak the language of the people who've driven them out of their homes, right? They cling to their original tongues, and they certainly have my understanding for that.
Then we get mention of the Rohirrim in the context of clinging to their own languages, although that's not made explicitly clear.
It's weird. The mention of the Rohirrim is right after the mention of the Wildmen and the Dunlendings. But here's the thing. Everybody, and I mean everybody, even the Dunlendings or some of them, used the common speech as a lingua franca. That included the elves, even if we're talking about exiled Noldor, or if we're talking about Sindar. It included the Dunlendings, of course, but even the Druidine, as we would see later on with Han Brichan.
Yeah.
Not all of them, of course, and even those that probably couldn't speak it very well, again, as we experienced with the leader of the Druidine there.
Yeah, I just want to mention, Tolkien doesn't talk about it here, but we get another instance where the orcs themselves speak the common speech, because different tribes of orcs don't have a common tongue other than the common speech. It's quite interesting
Yeah, and we'll get into that at length later in this episode. But their own language got because they were so tribal, they had to find a common language, and this ended up being a lingua franca for essentially the entire world. Basically, if you're going to have any interaction with another race of people that speak another language, you've got to have a way to communicate. The common speech was that.
Yeah.
And that's why Tolkien represents it with English.
Right.
Because English is arguably one of the more frequently spoken lingua francas in the world.
Right. And I mean, one analogy I like to think of is the situation in India, which, has a huge diversity of language. But as a result, the common language that's spoken between people from different states in India is often the colonialist language of England. Of English. That's because the colonizer language is the only one that they know if you're from different parts of India. So.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of fascinating stuff in this episode ahead. I mean, the languages are so interesting, and we're going to keep moving. We're going to start off with some of the Elvish languages. James, would you take us away from there?
Absolutely. Of the Elves. The Elves, far back in the Elder Days, became divided into two main branches, the West Elves, the Eldar, and the East Elves. Of the latter kind were most of the elven folk of Mirkwood and Lorien, but their languages do not appear in this history, in which all the Elvish names and words are of Eldarin form. Of the Eldarin tongues, two are found in this book, the High Elven, or Quenya, and the Grey Elven, or Sindarin. The High Elven was an ancient tongue of Eldamar beyond the sea, the first to be recorded in writing. It was no longer a birth tongue, but had become, as it were, an Elven Latin, still used for ceremony and for high matters of law and song by the High Elves, who had returned in exile to Middle-earth at the end of the First Age. The Grey Elven was in origin akin to Quenya, for it was the language of those Eldar who, coming to the shores of Middle-earth, had not passed over the sea, but had lingered on the coasts in the country of Beleriand. There, Thingol Greycloak of Doriath was their king, and in the long twilight their tongue had changed with the changefulness of mortal lands, and had become far estranged from the speech of the Eldar from beyond the sea. The exiles, dwelling among the more numerous grey elves, had adopted the Sindarin for daily use, and hence it was the tongue of all those elves and elf lords that appear in this history. For these were all of Eldarin race, even where the folk that they had ruled were of the lesser kindreds. Noblest of all was the Lady Galadriel of the royal house of Finarfin, and sister of Finrod Felagund, king of Nargothrond. In the hearts of the exiles, the yearning for the sea was an unquiet, never to be stilled. In the hearts of the grey elves it slumbered, but once awakened, it could not be appeased.
The sleeper has awakened. There's a lot in this passage. I mean, I kept wanting to interrupt you. You're like, the exiles dwelling among the numerous gray elves and the ones that had threatened to kill them if they spoke their language had adopted the Sindarin for daily use. We'll get to that, though.
I was just going to say, what's amazing about this is that there's history in this that we otherwise wouldn't know prior to the Silmarillion. Right?
I know. That's the thing. There's so much behind this. It sort of glosses over, like we talked about with the Tale of Years being written with this sort of pro-Elendil, let's legitimize Elendil as the rightful heir, so to speak. Here we have sort of glossing over what Thingol did. But we'll definitely expand on that. So
not only glossing over certain things, but that this is the only time we come across some of these people in this part of the history.
That's true too. Yeah, you're right. Who's Finrod? Right? Where's Nargothrond? We've and by the way, folks, I will probably still slip and call it Nargothrond every now and then. But those of you turning in last week know from the writing and spelling, the pronunciation stuff, that it is in fact because of the TH and the R. That's two consonantal sounds. That makes it Nargothrond, not Nargothrond. It's so hard to do that. Anyway, going back to the beginning of that passage, and again at the end, even there's weird, like you said, it's the only place we're going to get some of that history. But it also feels weird because how does that fit in with the languages? Why is this relevant?
Well, and we did discuss that in the Pengoloð episode in particular, of course, was all about this question of, questions got raised by this of how did it, because we got, I just want to quickly mention, they say that in the long twilight that their tongue had changed with the changefulness of mortal lands. And that ties in with the whole Pengoloð discussion that we had. Yep.
Yeah, except that it was more like they kept crafting it and making it better because there was like an intentionality of it from the Elves.
Well, that's what we learned. That's what we learned from that
from good old Pengoloð.
That Pengoloð
Thus quoth Pengoloð. So going back to the beginning of this, first we're told about that Eldar Avari split, though here they're just called the East Elves, not the Avari, because the term Avari is not in the Lord of the Rings, so that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Just again, speaking of terms that get introduced, I've mentioned this before, that the name Quenya and Sindarin are not mentioned in the main text of Lord of the Rings either.
They're not.
Here's where we find out that's what the names of these languages are.
Yep.
But anyway, in manuscript F2, we do get the Avari term. Yeah. And I quote, "The primary division was into Eldar and Avari. The Avari were those elves who remained content with Middle-earth," that was struck out, "and refused the summons of the powers, but they and their many secret tongues do not concern this book." So that's what F2 said.
Exactly. Now, the Avari, also known as Sir not appearing in this book, are described as making up most of the elven population east of the Misty Mountains, which is, again, interesting because when we think of elves, we don't think of the Avari. We're thinking of the named characters who are leading the Avari, but they are the numerous group. So they're the ones who make up most of the population to the east of the Misty Mountains. So we're talking about Lorien and Mirkwood, but they are linguistically irrelevant here.
Well, they are lesser kindred.
They are lesser kindred. Ooh, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah.
That makes for an awkward Thanksgiving. You get the lesser kindred table. Wow. So we're looking solely at the Eldarin words. So we're not looking at any language that the Avari might have spoken.
Yeah. And we get a useful footnote here, though, reminding us that Lorien, there the language spoken is Sindarin, but Tolkien says it's spoken with an accent, since most of its folk were of Sylvan origin. And in fact, that accent or dialect threw Frodo off, along with his own limited knowledge of Sindarin.
Yeah, because he was confused. Again, just like the letters where he thought he knew the Elvish letters, but he was reading them in a different mode. right?
Right.
Back when he was looking at,
When he sees the Balerian mode on the on the Westgate door.
Right.
He's like,
he got confused there. Like,
yeah.
that looks kind of familiar, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then similarly, when he gets to Lorien and they're speaking, he can understand snippets, but not much because, of course, it is Sindarin, but it's spoken in a sort of a Sylvan accent.
Yeah.
So the note then goes on to tell us that all the Elvish words cited in Book 2, chapters 6, 7, and 8, so that's the entire Lorien experience, are in fact Sindarin, and so are most of the names of places and persons. But Lorien, Carasgarathon, Amroth, Nimrodel are probably of Sylvan origin, adapted to Sindarin. But I've got a question for you, James. This can't be right, because Galadriel's lament is quite famously Quenya. Did he just kind of oversight here, just kind of forgot?
I think he just means, well, it's weird because he doesn't just say the names of places and persons. He specifically says all the Elvish words, and so are most of the names of places and persons. So what does he mean? If he's contrasting all the Elvish words and so are the most of the names of places and persons, I think he's made a mistake.
I think it's just an oops. I'm like, wait a minute, that's Quenya.
Because the vast bulk of the words that are not names of places and persons are in fact Quenya, because they're in the lament.
Yeah.
You don't get much Sindarin speech in that text.
No, I mean, you get, what's the word that Haldir says when he's basically telling them to be still, halt. I can't remember the word. It's 2 syllables with an O, but I can't remember the word off the top of my head.
Yeah,
but that's about it.
All you get. You get more Sindarin elsewhere.
And the word for rope, right? The mist rope, Hithline or something like that.
Yeah.
There's not much else that we get.
Yeah. Speaking of Sindarin and Quenya, we'll get to that discussion next. The High Elven is described as an ancient tongue of Eldamar beyond the sea, an Elven Latin, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
I love that. It's absolutely explicitly said to be like an Elven Latin, whereas last time we were talking about it sort of like, well, this is sort of like the way Latin is, right? It's this.
Right.
Yeah, here it's explicitly, it's an Elven Latin.
It's how Tolkien thought of it.
It's even how he thought of it, yeah. By the way, I looked up real quickly. The word is Daro.
That's right.
The halt was Daro. I knew it had an O in it, and it was 2 syllables. That's all I could remember. So that Quenya, that High Elven, that Elven Latin, it's said to be used only by the High Elves in exile. That would be, of course, the Noldor. While the Sindarin, or the Grey Elven tongue, was related. And we get the explanation. I like this. It's a partial explanation, at least, as to why those 2 tongues diverged. And it was because the Eldar who didn't go to Valinor stayed in Beleriand, and living under Thingol's rule in mortal lands, because that's where things change, their language became far estranged from Quenya.
Yep. And in F2, we get a bit more about the split in the Elven peoples and their tongues. And I quote, "Most of the Eldar then passed over the sea and came to that land in the ancient west, which they called Valinor, a name that means the land of the powers or rulers of the world. But some of the Eldar of the kindred of the Teleri remained behind in the northwest of Middle-earth, and these were called the Lembi, or Lingerers. It is with Eldarin tongues, Valinorian or Lemberan, changed to Telerian, that these tales are concerned." So it's interesting because the use of Lembi or Lingerers actually enables Christopher to date F2 to no later than the middle of 1950.
Correct.
We get this a lot where Christopher knows when his father decided to change a name.
Yeah.
Therefore, he can date things based on when he used this name, so therefore it must predate the name change.
Exactly.
But even then, by the way, Tolkien wrote that Quenya was, as it were, Elven Latin, even in F2.
Clearly, he's been thinking about that, like the entire time. And that's the structure, the framework in his mind. So then we're told that the Noldor took the Sindarin language for their regular use, retaining Quenya, quote, for matters of lore and song. But can we revisit this? Because that does sort of gloss over a little bit. Remember, King Thingol, after learning of the actions of some of the Noldor at Alqualonde, not all, told the sons of Finarfin, "Never again in my ears shall be heard the tongue of those who slew my kin in Alqualonde. Nor in all my realm shall it be openly spoken while my power endures. All the Sindar shall hear my command, that they shall neither speak with the tongue of the Noldor, nor answer to it. And all such as use it shall be held slayers of kin and betrayers of kin unrepentant." That is some strong words from Thingol.
Yeah. And this extinguishing of a language worked, right? And I
Oh,
quote,
absolutely.
It came to pass even as Thingol had spoken, for the Sindar heard his word, and thereafter throughout Beleriand they refused the tongue of the Noldor, and shunned those that spoke it aloud. But the exiles took the Sindarin tongue in all their daily uses, and the high speech of the West was spoken only by the lords of the Noldor among themselves. And I want to ask a question that we've asked a few times here.
Mm-hmm.
Given that we're not really getting the full story in Appendix F, whose point of view does that benefit?
Right. And why is it being glossed over? What?
Right.
I mean, because it would have taken much more space to say, the High Elves had to adopt the Sindarin tongue because Quenya was forbidden by the king. And maybe it doesn't explain why, because that's a long story. But,
sure.
You could have said that, but you didn't say that. You said, like, they just, why? What's the purpose here? Just like in Appendix B, we figure out that the purpose of those changes was to legitimize the line of Elendil as the rightful heir, the king of Numenor. And therefore, his descendants would be the rightful kings. Are we trying to not point out Thingol's sort of attempt at linguistic genocide?
Yeah.
I mean, is that what we're trying to protect here? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know who it is that we're trying to protect.
It's weird. It really is. But yeah, I have to wonder if that hadn't happened, right? If you'd just been like, okay, all of the kinslayers, you're out, you're gone, you're banished for forever. The rest of you, you're fine. You can stay and you can speak your language. Eventually, the Sindar would have spoken some of the Noldorin, but also the Noldor would have adopted some of the Sindarin. We'd have a more of a mixed language rather than two separate languages. And you wonder what form that would have taken. That's an interesting, that's a question well beyond the scope of a single episode. That's conlaying right there. But it's just interesting to kind of envision that maybe not all of the changes that happened to Sindarin would have happened because it would have been influenced more by Quenya. And Quenya would have had some changes within it because the two would eventually have become maybe a merged language, but with some lingering things that are only spoken in lore context.
Yeah, although it's not as if the language was completely forgotten. Everyone still knew Quenya, so the influence was still possible. It was just not.
Yeah, that's fair. But you wonder how much influence it would have had. Certainly as elven children were born in Beleriand after the Noldoran exiles returned, but then were forbidden to speak Quenya. They wouldn't have any influence at all. They wouldn't have known Quenya, and their parents wouldn't have spoken it because it was forbidden in their land. So
they would, they would have still come across it in again that the ceremonial and law stuff. So again, it comes back to the Latin analogy.
Yeah,
right. They would have learnt it, but not necessarily as a spoken language.
That's a fair point. Yeah. And probably just like Latin in the real world, a few people would have been very interested and learned it in depth. Right. And most of the rest of the people would have been like, whatever, I'm just going to use what I speak every day.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's a good point.
Pengoloð being a great example of somebody that's like, I'm totally going in for this elf Latin stuff. Yeah.
So yes, the Noldor took the Sindarin language for their daily use, but let's not make it sound like it was a choice. And then we get this bit that felt sort of, and we'll get to the question of the relevancy, but let's get this bit about Galadriel. First of all, I love this. She was the noblest of all.
Right. And this has always struck me, and there's a couple of passages like this that really, really sound like interpolations by some later pro-Galadriel scribe. I don't know if Tolkien was consciously thinking of it that way, but this happens all the time in medieval manuscripts. You get these statements that are clearly later insertions. Just bang smack in the middle of something, there'll be just something that says, but this king was the greatest of all.
A total non sequitur.
Exactly. And there are a couple of cases where that happens, always with Galadriel. That there's always some insertion about she was the greatest of all.
She's the greatest.
And I wonder if this is an example of that.
It kind of feels like that, doesn't it?
I like that. That's my headcanon anyway.
I like it.
There's all these insertions of how wonderful Galadriel was. But
Celeborn got his hands on the script.
It does occur to me, though, that I can't imagine Galadriel would have been. Well, I don't know what. I'm trying to think now what Galadriel would have made of the banning of Quenya and Thingol's actions, because she certainly would have been sympathetic to his reasons.
Oh yeah,
right. He was annoyed at the annoyed's
a very mild way of putting it. Yeah,
it was the Alqualande kinslaying was a big part of why he didn't want it spoken, and of course Galadriel would have shared that sentiment completely.
Oh yeah.
So it's interesting. It can't just be a pro-Galadriel thing.
No, it can't be. Because, of course, she was also part of the reason why he didn't find out earlier. I mean, she kw. She wouldn't answer. She was like, no, I'm not telling you, Melian.
Yeah. Melian's
like,
kind of like,
that's in my past. Can we leave the past in the past? And Melian's like, but there's something important going on. You're hiding something. Yep.
Yeah.
Not going to tell you.
Yeah.
Not going to do it. Yeah.
But then we get this fascinating bit about the yearning of the for the sea.
Another weird bit. Like, what?
Yeah. Again, just these little snippets that make total sense if you read the Silmarillion, but they would have been quite new to readers of Lord of the Rings.
That's true.
For the first couple of decades. Because we're told that the Noldor face this all the time.
Yeah.
This yearning for the sea. While the Sindar are fine until it's awakened.
Which we see, in Legolas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that once that's awakened, it's like, oh man, I can't stick around. Gimli, want to take a road trip. But yeah, it's a reminder that the Noldor face this all the time, and you think about what Galadriel is enduring, and you hear her speak about it during the lament.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I have to just shout out to my boy Círdan.
Oh,
just
absolutely.
Círdan's the ultimate. Like, I desperately want to go.
He wanted to get over there before.
But I can't. I know there's stuff that needs to be done.
I mean, what's that story we read about him in History of Middle Earth that he basically says, okay, now that they've all gone, I missed the boat. I'm going to make my own boat, and I'm going to sail to Valinor. And they're like, no, actually, you can't do that yet. You need to wait.
It's like you're not able to build a good enough boat, first of all. I'm going to keep working on building the best boat until I can build a boat that's capable of doing it. And then, plot twist, you're not the one that's going to get to sail the boat after all this.
Not until the very end of time, basically.
Yeah. Amazing.
You've got the world's longest job and shortest retirement. Yeah. But both of these little bits, the bit about Galadriel being the noblest of all, which is, like you said, feels like an insertion. And then this bit about the yearning, the sea yearning from both the Noldoran perspective and the Sindarin perspective. They're really interesting inclusions, but they're in a section that's nominally about language. Why do you think, in a place where Tolkien was so pressed for space, as Christopher explained,
it's true.
Why did he choose to use some of that space on information that has zero to do with Quenya or Sindarin?
Well, it's interesting because obviously he does spend a bit of time in this section talking about the history of the elves and their sundering and so on, and that is vital to understand.
That's totally relevant. I mean, that is.
And in fact, we know that Tolkien actually invented the sundering story to explain the language.
Exactly why, right?
When he did this initially, the languages were very different, and it was the language of the Noldor that was actually the Welsh-like one, and so on, right? So he completely changed his conception of what Gnomish was and all that kind of stuff, and Sindarin didn't exist as a term. No. But given this notion of two languages, both spoken by elves that had an earlier origin but were now sundered, he had to come up with a story of how two groups of elves got sundered, and that was sort of the beginning.
Which is basically the root of the Silmarillion was, I need a reason to explain why these languages are different.
Exactly. And I can't help but wonder if there's a little, especially the sea yearning.
Yeah.
Feels like that's still an important part of that. And I mean, it obviously, as you said, the sea yearning in the context of Galadriel in particular is important to understanding her and what she's gone through and passing the test and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's why he felt it was so important to include here, even though it's not, as you say, it's not about language.
It's not connected to the language.
But it's just so important to the story he wanted to tell.
And I mean, certainly the sea longing I see being connected to Galadriel very clearly. And that's relevant in a big way because it reminds you of the sacrifice that she's making as a Noldoran exile and fighting that desire compared to a Sindarin elf who would be able to, be fine until that desire got awakened. That's real. It's just weird that they're connected to this section on languages.
Yeah.
It just feels like an odd little inclusion. I'm glad he included it, especially because, like you said, if you hadn't read the Silmarillion, which you couldn't have done for more than 20 years after this came out, this is the only place you're going to get this bit of history. And I love that. But it is really, really interesting that he put this in here.
The only other thing that occurs to me is if he somehow saw the history of the languages as ultimately culminating in the reunification of the speakers.
That could work. Yeah, that could be it. Now, soon we'll get back to the languages of men and hobbits, but before we do, we want to remind you there is a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony podcast than just us.
The PPP has an amazing listener community. They're always coming up with great questions and discussions across all our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, our dedicated subreddit, Twitter, and more.
Now, on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony podcast. You're going to follow the page to get the news and episode drops, but you're going to want to join the group to get involved in some great discussions.
On Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitch, TikTok, and YouTube, we're at Prancing Pony Pod. Or if you prefer Reddit, find us there at r/Prancing Pony Pod.
And if you want daily Tolkien content, and come on, I mean, everybody wants daily Tolkien content, so go listen, go watch today's Tolkien Times, folks. Go watch or listen on the PPP YouTube channel or your favorite podcast apps. That's my short format daily show. It's like 8 to 10 minutes a day. I've got everything from Middle-earth Map Monday to Word Nerd Wednesday and Silmarillion Saturdays. We also have a twice weekly stream of all fun things Middle-earth on the PPP Plays. So be sure to check both of those out on the YouTube channel for all the PPP productions at youtube.com/@PrancingPonyPod.
Okay, so we talked about the Elvish languages. We next get a discussion about the languages of men. Alan, as Man of the West, would you like to read the next section for us?
Indeed, I will. Of men. The Westron was a mannish speech, though enriched and softened under Elvish influence. It was in origin the language of those whom the Eldar called the Atani, or Edain, fathers of men, being especially the people of the three houses of the elf friends, who came west into Beleriand in the First Age, and aided the Eldar in the War of the Great Jewels against the Dark Power of the North. After the overthrow of the Dark Power, in which Beleriand was for the most part drowned or broken, it was granted as a reward to the elf friends that they also, as the Eldar, might pass west over sea. But since the Undying Realm was forbidden to them, a great isle was set apart for them, most westerly of all mortal lands. The name of that isle was Numenor, Westerness. Most of the elf friends therefore departed and dwelt in Numenor, and there they became great and powerful, mariners of renown and lords of many ships. They were fair of face and tall, and the span of their lives was thrice that of the men of Middle-earth. These were the Númenóreans, the kings of men, whom the elves called the Dunedain. The Dunedain alone of all races of men knew and spoke an elvish tongue, for their forefathers had learned the Sindarin tongue, and this they handed on to their children as a matter of lore, changing little with the passing of the years. And their men of wisdom learned also the high elven Quenya, and esteemed it above all other tongues, and in it they made names for many places of fame and reverence, and for many men of royalty and great renown. But the native speech of the Númenóreans remained for the most part their ancestral mannish tongue, the Adunaic, and to this, in the latter days of their pride, their kings and lords returned, abandoning the elven speech, save only those few that held still to their ancient friendship with the Eldar. In the years of their power, the Númenóreans had maintained many forts and havens upon the western coasts of Middle-earth for the help of their ships, and one of the chief of these was at Pelargir, near the mouths of Anduin. There Adunaic was spoken, and, mingled with many words of the languages of lesser men, it became a common speech that spread thence along the coasts among all that had dealings with Westerness.
Okay, so
All right.
Now we move past the role and reach of Westron and get to its origins.
Yes.
It's a mannish speech, but the text adds that it was enriched and softened thanks to influence from the elves.
Like a loaf of Weber bread. I don't know why that just popped into my head. Like that super squishy bread that like...
There you go. enriched, because you do get enriched.
Yeah.
It's a word that gets used.
It's basically because they strip all the
strip
goodness
everything
out of the wheat and then
exactly.
they shove it in somehow.
Exactly.
Can you tell I don't eat that stuff?
I don't either.
I think I had a peanut butter sandwich with it when I was 9, and that's about it.
So anyway, this language was originally the tongue of the Edain, specifically the 3 houses of Elfren. So the House of Beor, the House of Hador, and the House of Harleth.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get a very brief summary of the history behind the establishment of Numenor, which, of course, we got in a lot more detail in Appendix A, which Don Marshall and I covered earlier this season. Now, all that before we're told that the Dunedain, the men of the West, were the only men that knew an Elvish language. And of course, because they're amazing Numenorians, they knew too. They spoke Sindarin as a matter of lore, with a few of their wisest also learning Quenya and using it for the names of places and people. And this is a perfect place to remind you all the kings of Gondor had Quenya names, even Aragorn, who was known as King Elessar. And Aragorn is, of course, Sindarin, but Elessar is Quenya.
Yeah. We're told, though, that even though they knew and spoke Sindarin, and a few knew Quenya, their native speech was their ancestral mannish tongue, the Adonaic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the F2 manuscript, we read, "The language of the Dunedain was thus the Elvish Noldorin, though their high lords and men of wisdom knew also the Quenya." That would have been when there was a split between those two. It was only when Elendil and the faithful fled to Middle-earth and established the realms in exile that they, quote, found a common tongue in use along the coastlands from the mouths of the Anduin to the icy bay of Farhel in the north. This tongue was in Noldorin called Falathren, or shore language, but by its users it was called Yandune, which was changed to Andunar, Adunar, that is Westron, or Sovul Fare, that is common speech.
It's so interesting to read that in the other version of the draft, because in this version then, the common speech was a later form of the native language of the fathers of men from back in the First Age. That is a language that then developed in their absence. But then we get this very interesting tidbit about the common speech. One of the greatest of the havens had been at Pelargir above the mouths of Anduin, and it is said that it was the language of that region, which was afterwards called Gondor, that was the foundation of the common speech. But Sauron, who could turn all things devised by elves or men to his own evil purposes, had also favored the spread of this common speech, for it was useful to him in the governing of his vast lordship in the dark years. And I want to talk a little bit about how this version differs from the published version, because yes, it still references Pelargir, but there's a couple of big differences. It sounds like in this version, the version that he discarded in favor of the final version, that the common speech developed in the absence of it was no longer Adunaic. It was like Adunaic plus whatever changes it had undergone while the Numenorians were in Numenor. And then, of course, the second big change is this idea that Sauron actually favored the spread of this common speech.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just going a bit deeper on Sauron's motivation, I think, again, it comes to this idea of, in this case, it's not necessarily colonialist. It's a different kind of imperialism that's being enforced here. But that having a common language is a good way of...
Oh, yeah.
Governing is used as a word here, but also lordship, right? That lording it over people is easier if you can, well, certainly the governing, right? If you're governing a large territory, then having a common language makes that easier. Having local languages enables, groups to splinter off, rebel, and so on. Yeah.
That is interesting. There's a lot there, I think. It was interesting that the idea that it was a different tongue. I also thought the words that Tolkien originally used to describe it, Soval Fare, which is not, I've never seen that phrase anyplace else.
No, and I presume it literally means common speech in that in language.
Adunaic. Yeah.
Yeah, or the Falathren as the Noldoran call it. Yeah, the shore language. Yeah.
It's just interesting. Anyway, yeah.
So in the paragraph we skipped, we read about the Dunedain after the downfall and their return to Middle-earth.
That's right. Now, the people who were descended from the Numenorians didn't remember the Elvish language that the exiles spoke, right? So when I say descended from the Númenóreans, they're descended from the same people the Númenóreans were descended from. So the Edain, right, most of those folks ended up becoming the Númenóreans. The ones that didn't, their descendants didn't remember Sindarin, but the exiles did. So instead they used this common speech, but then it was enlarged and enriched with the Sindarin words. And that's great. Now we're starting to get this merging of the languages. Yes, it's still Westron, it's still Adunaic, but we've added some things from Sindarin in terms of words, in terms maybe of some structural changes, who knows? But yeah, really good stuff. Of course, that's not all about the Mannish languages. If I'd taken all of that, we'd still be reading. James, would you finish up the section about the Mannish languages?
Absolutely. In the days of the Númenórean kings, this ennobled Westron speech spread far and wide, even among their enemies, and it became used more and more by the Dunedain themselves, so that at the time of the War of the Ring, the Elven tongue was known to only a small part of the peoples of Gondor, and spoken daily by fewer. These dwelt mostly in Minas Tirith and the townlands adjacent, and in the land of the tributary princes of Dol Amroth. Yet the names of nearly all places and persons in the realm of Gondor were of Elvish form and meaning. A few were of forgotten origin and descended doubtless from the days before the ships of the Númenóreans sailed the sea. Among these were Umbar, Arnach, and Erech, and the mountain names Eilenach and Rimon. Forlong was also a name of the same sort. Most of the men of the northern regions of the Westlands were descended from the Edain of the First Age, or from their close kin. Their languages were therefore related to the Adunaic, and some still preserved a likeness to the common speech. Of this kind were the peoples of the upper vales of Anduin, the Beornings and the woodmen of western Mirkwood, and further north and east the men of the Long Lake and of Dale. From the lands between the Gladden and the Carrock came the folk that were known in Gondor as the Rohirrim, masters of horses. They still spoke their ancestral tongue and gave new names in it to nearly all the places in their new country, and they called themselves the Eorlings, or the men of the Riddermark. But the lords of that people used the common speech freely and spoke it nobly after the manner of their allies in Gondor. For in Gondor, whence it came, the Westron kept still a more gracious and antique style. Wholly alien was the speech of the wild men of Druadan Forest. Alien too, or only remotely akin, was the language of the Dunlendings. These were a remnant of the peoples that had dwelt in the vales of the White Mountains in ages past. The dead men of Dunharrow were of their kin. But in the dark years, others had removed to the southern dales of the Misty Mountains, and thence some had passed into the empty lands as far north as the Barrow-Downs. From them came the men of Bree. But long before these had been subjects of the North Kingdom of Arnor, and had taken up the Westron tongue.
Thank you, James. That's there's a lot here. I'm really excited to sort of dive in, because we start with the concept of Westron spreading even among the enemies of Númenor. So we get a hint about the sort of about the Sauron thing that we talked about at the end of the last reading, and I thought that was interesting to start with.
Yeah. And there's a bit of use it or lose it too, as Westron becomes the dominant tongue of the Dunedain, and as time passes, it's been over 3,000 years after all.
That's true.
Sindarin becomes less and less known.
Well, I mean, that actually raises a good point. I'm not much of a linguist. I know you are, so I'm going to ask you, my linguist friend, talk about primary world language change over the course of that kind of time frame, 3 millennia.
Yeah, I mean that's huge in terms of
massive.
language. It doesn't take long for languages to change if there's a lot going on, I guess, in terms of the amount of travel and commerce and so on. If languages don't change at an even rate.
That's true.
And you can see this particularly in something like Greek, where the modern Greek is actually not that far from Greek that was spoken, say, 1,500 years ago. Most of the changes in the Greek language actually took place in the first few hundred years of the first millennium. And that was when Greek was the lingua franca.
Yeah.
So when languages are the lingua franca and they're spoken across entire, broad geographic spaces, you tend to get accelerated change.
That makes sense.
in the language as a result of that. When you have it in more isolated communities, it can last a bit longer. But still,
That makes me think of Icelandic, which is strikingly similar to Old Icelandic. I mean, it virtually hasn't changed at all.
yeah. I mean, the comment that I've read a few times is that as you get further and further out from continental Scandinavia out to Iceland, the language just becomes more and more conservative. And so, whereas somebody in Sweden would read Old Norse the way we would read Old English, someone in, say, the Faroe Islands would see Old Norse as more like we would see Middle English.
Much
and then,
closer.
of course,
in Iceland,
Icelanders, it's more like Shakespeare.
Yeah, what's the difference?
It sounds funny as
right. Yeah.
the story I've told before of trying to speak Old Norse to the Icelandic flight attendant on Air Iceland.
Why are you talking like my grandfather?
Yeah, she understood me, but said we don't talk like that anymore. Right.
Yeah.
So that's not something that you would a Swede would never say that if you spoke Old Norse to them, they wouldn't understand what on earth you're saying. And so again, you get this sort of different rates of change of languages for sure. But this is 3,000 years is a huge amount of time. I mean,
especially one thinks for a Mannish tongue. I don't know why I get the feeling that an Elvish tongue, I know they changed because we talked about that during the Pengoloð episode.
But deliberately so.
But you feel like the rate of change would be different in an Elvish language? Like because of the lifespans of the people speaking it?
You would imagine so. But I mean that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing that the Dungreth Pengoloð is trying to unpack.
He's trying to say, hey, we changed too. And
we do. We do change. But yeah, certainly in terms of the Mannish change, I mean, just to put things into perspective, 3,000 years for human language. I mean, it's not quite as great as modern back to Proto-Indo-European, but it's certainly more than Proto-Germanic. So in other words, by 3,000 years ago, every single Germanic language would have been the same. They probably would have been similar to other Proto-Indo-European language, to other Indo-European languages.
Right.
So if you take the difference between any of the Germanic languages, even something like, I mean, let's pick something like a Slavic language. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the difference that we're talking about with 3,000 years, say the difference between English and Russian.
Wow.
That would be a 3,000 year difference. So, occasionally if you squint really hard, you might say, I can see how that word might be related to this word I know, but it's certainly not intelligible at all.
No.
I mean, even you can go back 500 years and it's not particularly intelligible.
No, I was going to say.
And certainly 1,000 years, it's in most cases completely unrecognizable. So 3,000 years is a big time, a big period of time for language change.
Yeah, 3,000 years, long time. No wonder.
Yeah. But we're told that the folk who still know and speak Sindarin are the ones in and near Minas Tirith and Dol Amroth.
Yeah. Why is that?
So one of the things that comes into play with all this, and we've seen touches of this before in the use of the Quenya names that you already mentioned, and we had in our readings, is this whole notion of prestige, right? There's sort of this association with certain languages or dialects that can preserve certain things. And it works both ways, right? You can have situations where a group wants to distance itself, so will deliberately not use a particular language or dialect, and you get other cases where groups are like, no, we want to be associated with the past and so on. And it makes sense that people around Minas Tirith and Dol Amroth would have had a closer connection and affinity for the glory days of Isildur and so on, and so perhaps would have wanted to retain that sort of more conservative language use, the fact that the Sindarin was spoken among the Numenorians that came over the realms in exile,
which would include Dol Amroth, because that they were established even before the downfall,
right? Yes, and had an elvish connection as well.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, then we get this clear reminder, of course, that most of the names of the places and people are Sindarin, but also the fact that some names, interestingly enough, were actually of pre-Numenorian origin. So we're talking about the language of the original inhabitants of the land. Several examples, including some very well-known names like two of the Beacon Hills. I had to wonder, though, and I wonder if this is something that's ever occurred to you as well, is Tolkien sometimes using the excuse, that's a pre-Numenorian word. Is that ever just a way to avoid retconning some sort of weird language fix?
I'm absolutely convinced it is.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
And here's why. So there's this whole thing right? So obviously This happens in primary languages as well. So if you look at languages in Western Europe that are mostly descended from Proto-Indo-European,
right?
You get some counterexamples, the Basque language, which some people think might actually have Indo-European origins, but for the longest time was thought not to be related. And you get Hungarian and Finnish and stuff like that. But even within the language that's sort of established as an Indo-European language, you get some words that don't fit the rules.
Mm-hmm.
They have letter combinations that you would not expect in the language. And for example, this happens in Greek. You occasionally get a name of a place or a person, and it's kind of like, that doesn't really work in terms of the way we think the phonology of the language works and how it descended from Proto-Indo-European and so on.
Right.
And there are a lot of people that speculate that maybe that was what's referred to as pre-Greek. This was a name that was given to this place before the Indo-Europeans moved in.
Okay.
Amongst Indo-European scholars and Greek scholars, there's variation in how much this is accepted.
Mm-hmm.
Very famously, there's a Proto-Indo-European scholar, a Dutch scholar at University of Leiden, and this is very much associated with the University of Leiden, that is really big on any word that doesn't fit the pattern we're expecting must be pre-Greek. And so this is very much a thing, and I can absolutely believe that Tolkien is doing the same thing, which is, I really like this name. It doesn't fit or no longer fits my phonological conception of this language. How can I keep this name in this place even though it doesn't fit the language that they're supposed to have spoken there?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that it predates, that it's a pre-Numenorian origin. I think that's a wonderfully realistic way of getting around the problem and letting Tolkien fulfill that phonoaesthetic goal that he's like, I really want to have a word Erich.
Yeah, but I like this word.
Exactly.
Even if it doesn't fit, I'm going to use this word.
And we know Christopher talks about this in some other cases as well. Like, there's an inconsistency in some places with what the plural of Orod is. So mountain, Orod, is the plural Ered or Erud with a Y.
Yeah.
And Tolkien just waves his hand and basically says it's a dialect difference.
Yeah.
Right? So in some regions it's spelt this way, in other regions it's spelled another way. And there's no reason to think he's not doing exactly the same thing.
That makes sense.
If he wants to keep it, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. It's to avoid retconning the language.
I think that only came to me after reading the Rivers and Hills of Gondor, the Rivers and Beacon Hills of Gondor in The Nature of Middle-earth. And it was kind of like, I smell something here. I think he's just finding a way to keep these names without having to come up with a linguistic, twist to make it work. Yeah. That's great.
And we're gonna get later to him basically doing that with the whole concept of the dwarves having outer names and stuff like that.
Yeah,
the
that's
ultimate,
beautiful retcon.
The ultimate retcon. Yeah. But we'll get to that.
We will.
Yeah, so we get this reminder of how most of the men, the exceptions being the Druidine and the Dunlendings, among others, that live in the area where the stories take place, of the Westlands, were kin, and to one degree or another, of kin of the Edain themselves, which explains why their own tongues were connected to Adonaic and thus also to the common speech, which descended from Adonaic.
Right. Now, and specifically, it's the people of the upper vales of Anduin. These are the Beornings and the Woodmen, as well as the men of Dale in that area. But we're also pointed specifically to the Eotheod, though they're not named that here.
Mm-hmm.
These are the ancestors of the Rohirrim.
Yeah. And we're told that they speak their own tongue, but the lords, e.g. Theoden, etc., used Westron and spoke it nobly, like in Gondor.
Spoke it nobly.
Because in Gondor, they still spoke it in a, quote, more gracious and antique style.
I liked that. That was a really interesting call out, because it made me think of something that we noticed in the Council of Elrond. Well, anybody who's read the Council of Elrond chapter, and you, of course, have looked at that 1,000 times for the Digital Tolkien Project, is how each of the different people speak. And Boromir certainly speaks in the more gracious and antique style, but it's nothing compared to when Gandalf is quoting Isildur and Isildur's speech from 3,000 years before, and how very gracious and antique that style is. And once again, it comes back to this idea of sort of that prestige and that feeling of a little bit of superiority.
Yep, for sure.
The proper way, It's really interesting that the more gracious and antique style does explain a lot. And in F2, though, Tolkien actually gives us a bit more, specifically referring to the relatively recent move of the Rohirrim and to the idea that more than just their lords spoke the common speech. He writes there, the Eorlings, or the Rohirrim as they were called in Gondor, still used their own northern tongue. For the riders of Rohan had come out of Eotheod near the sources of Anduin, only some 500 years before the days here spoken of. Yet all but their humbler folk spoke also the common speech after the manner of Gondor. And I'm like, only some 500 years before? I mean, you look back at our own English language, and I'm sorry, but if I'm reading something written in the 1520s, that's not going to look like modern English, even if it's still technically modern English. It's a long time linguistically, like we talked about.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things you'd understand it, but you wouldn't talk like that.
No, I don't think I could, right? Unless it was a script that I memorized.
Yeah. It's very difficult to fake. Yeah,
but, in this case, of course, we're not talking about adopting a new language taking that long, right? It's not taking the Rohirrim 500 years to adopt the common speech. They've done that. It's just that over those 500 years, the old language hasn't died out, which that I get. Like that sort of makes a little more sense.
Again, because of the isolationism, right? They're not interacting with a lot of different groups. So, and they've got a strong sense of identity and so on. So the language change would be more conservative. Yeah.
And 500 years is a lot less than the 3,000 that we saw for, the descendants of the Númenóreans or the descendants of the Edain split off from the Númenóreans.
Well, again, think of the Icelanders, right? 500 years is not a huge amount for them in terms of. Right?
That's true. No, it's a very good
500
example.
years is a lot less than the distance between the Poetic Edda, say, and modern Icelandic.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, we get the examples of the two races of men whose language is completely different.
Yeah.
So the first is the Druidine. Nothing is really made of this beyond the claim that their language is alien.
Yeah.
And even in the chapter on the Druidine in Unfinished Tales, we don't get a lot on their language.
No.
Just that the word drug was a word of their own tongue.
Yeah, that's really it. The other alien tongue, of course, is out of the Dunlendings, the descendants of the original inhabitants of the White Mountains. But we do get the additional note that the original inhabitants of the White Mountains and their descendants would have included the dead men of Dunharrow, which I find interesting because then once again, we also get the stone of Erech being a word that is not a Sindarin word, but an original pre-Númenórean name.
Yeah. Many of these folk had migrated either east to the Misty Mountains or north towards what we now know as the Barrow Downs. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, the men of Bree are descended from these people.
Yeah.
But they adopted Westron long before.
I have a hard time seeing Barliman related to the people calling for Theoden's head outside of Helm's Deep. But yeah, it is only in Dunland itself where these men rejected Westron and kept to their own ways, right? It was symbolic of their rejection. We talked before,
Mm-hmm.
These are the invaders. We're not going to take their language, right? So they reject the Dunedain and the Rohirrim as well, who they obviously saw as secondary invaders. I mean, it's bad enough the Númenóreans came and took most of our land. And now they're giving it to you. You're also invading our land. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're given one word from their language, Forgoil, meaning straw heads. A reference to the blonde hair of the Rohirrim.
Oh, man, I love that.
Interestingly, the name of their people and the land, Dunlendings, Dunland, little side note here. I was going to say Rohirric, but we've got to be really careful. And this is again something I know I'm going to trip myself up on.
Fair.
So often when we say that something is Rohirric, what we really mean is it's the Old English that Tolkien is using to represent Rohirric or the Rohanese language and so on. So I'll say Rohirric representative rather than Rohirric.
That's fair. That's a good way of putting it. It's not Sindarin though. That's the point.
It's not Sindarin, but it's not actually Rohirric either. And we do get a couple of examples of Rohirric words, but this is the point, right? That this is connected. It's not the Sindarin Dun meaning west as in Dunedain. It's the Old English Dun meaning dingy brown or dark colored. Right. And this connects to Tolkien's description of them, their swarthy appearance.
Yeah.
So that word, the Dun in Dunlendings or Dunland, is an Old English word representing the language of the Rohirrim.
Because just as English represents Westron, Old English represents Rohirric or
exactly,
Rohanese.
As we'll discuss in the next episode in more detail.
Yeah, that's more next week when we get into the on translation.
But I did want to mention that there's a few places I'm sure where we're going to talk about, this is a Rohirric word or a Rohanese word, and we need to be it's one of those things we need to be a little careful that it's like saying that the word the is Westron. Well, no.
No.
but it is a word that
It's the English translation of a word that represents something.
Yeah, Westron would have had a word.
And yeah, you're right, because in Westron we sort of we've read enough to understand that we're reading a translated language.
Right.
But it's a little trickier when we're seeing a language that itself needs to be translated to us. Most of the time, Old English needs to be, we need to understand what that word means in Old English.
Yeah.
We're struggling with the idea of that language representing yet a third language.
Yes.
Because it's already a second language.
And I definitely want to talk a lot more about this in the next episode, particularly with regard to how you then handle the translation of these books into other languages. Ooh. How do you do this whole thing if you're doing a French translation of Lord of the Rings?
Oh my goodness.
Well, how do the Rohirrim speak in the Spanish translation?
Here's my question for that. Would Tolkien even bother with a French translation? I know he detested French food, at least. I'm not sure how much more. No, I'm kidding to our French listeners.
But we will talk about that this is definitely something I want to talk about in the next episode.
We definitely will. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I need to remember to bring in, when I'm prepping that episode, I need to bring in stuff from the nomenclature because that is because it's not really key.
Well, the interesting thing there is not to preempt too much the episode. The interesting thing is that Tolkien's approach in the nomenclature kind of goes against what you might think in terms of this representative translation.
Yeah.
And to be honest, spoiler alert, I think it's just because he didn't trust anyone else to be philologically sophisticated enough.
Given his experience with the early translators, can you blame him?
He's kind of like, if I were doing the translation, you can imagine Tolkien would have actually used like Old Spanish for the Rohirrim in the Spanish translation Lord of the Rings or something.
Sure.
But he's like, I don't trust the Spanish translators to know enough philology, to know
and
enough.
And that would have gone for
Iberian
everybody.
Phonology. Exactly.
Yeah, no disrespect to the Spanish translators. He would have felt that way about all of them. But particularly the Swedish translator, who he had zero appreciation for, understandably. But we will get to that.
Well, and he's what really annoyed him was the attempt to translate the Elvish, and he's like, "Do not, under any circumstance, touch
do
my
not
Elvish."
Touch. And also, how dare you write your own foreword? But anyway, we totally digress.
we do.
We'll come back to that some other time. All right,
we will.
Folks, if you're enjoying the PPP, please consider supporting the show by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. It's what gives me the time and resources to work on making this show the best that it can be. And when you join, you become part of an amazing Discord community that includes live episode recordings. One is happening right now. We've got dozens of folks listening in live as we're doing this. Hangouts every month. You also get episode postscripts, ad-free episodes, free merch, and more.
There are dozens of us. Dozens. You can also become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
And of course, you can always help us out by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends.
Okay, so we've talked about the languages of elves and men. Let's move on to talking about hobbits.
Hobbits. I love this one. All right. Of hobbits. The hobbits of the Shire and of Bree had at this time, for probably 1,000 years, adopted the common speech. They used it in their own manner, freely and carelessly, though the more learned among them had still at their command a more formal language when occasion required. There is no record of any language peculiar to hobbits. In ancient days, they seem always to have used the languages of men near whom or among whom they lived. Thus, they quickly adopted the common speech after they entered Eriador, and by the time of their settlement at Bree, they had already begun to forget their former tongue. This was evidently a Mannish language of the Upper Anduin, akin to that of the Rohirrim, though the southern Sturs appear to have adopted a language related to Dunlendish before they came north to the Shire. Of these things in the time of Frodo, there were still some traces left in local words and names, many of which closely resembled those found in Dale or in Rohan. Most notable were the names of days, months, and seasons. Several other words of the same sort, such as matham and smile, were also still in common use, while more were preserved in the place names of Bree and the Shire. The personal names of the hobbits were also peculiar, and many had come down from ancient days. Hobbit was the name usually applied by the Shire folk to all their kind. Men called them halflings, and the elves Periannath. The origin of the word hobbit was by most forgotten. It seems, however, to have been at first a name given to the Harfoots by the Fallowhides and Stoors, and to be a worn-down form of a word preserved more fully in Rohan, Holbitla, meaning hole builder.
Okay, so finally we get to the language of the heroes of our story, the hobbits.
Yes.
And it opens by telling us that for about a millennium now, the hobbits of both Bree and the Shire have been using the common speech.
That's right, which suggests, interestingly, that for at least the first 400 years or so of their time in the Shire, the hobbits were not using the common speech. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's a little mix-up here.
Yep. So the Shire was founded in Third Age 1601, and the "at this time" is talking about the War of the Ring, which was in Third Age 3019, so more than 1,400 years later.
That's right. Now, we're also told, and I love this, they speak Westron freely and carelessly, in sharp contrast to the more gracious and antique style of Gondor.
Yeah, indeed. So what did they speak prior to adopting the common speech? Well, the text tells us that they never had their own Hobbit language. They just used the tongues of whatever men were closest to them.
And now we get more clarification on the timeline of adoption. It started when they entered Eriador. Okay, Tale of Years tells us the Harfoots came in around 1050, the Fallowhides 100 years later around 1150, which was the same year that the Stoors moved into the Angle or to Dunland. So that's actually closer to 1900 to 2000 years ago.
By the time they settle in Bree, 1300, about 300 years before the founding of the Shire, they've already begun to forget their previous language, much more quickly than, say, the Rohirrim.
Yeah. Now, what was the language they used to speak? Well, it was a Mannish tongue, so it was related to Adunaic and therefore to the common speech to some extent, and it was close to the language of the Rohirrim, and that reminded me of this moment in the Muster of Rohan. But most of the time, especially on this last day, Merry had ridden by himself just behind the king, saying nothing, and trying to understand the slow, sonorous speech of Rohan that he heard the men behind him using. It was a language in which there seemed to be many words that he knew, though spoken more richly and strongly than in the Shire, yet he could not piece the words together.
So it's similar to perhaps what hearing Old English would be like.
Yeah, every once in a while you'd catch a word and you'd be like, wait a minute, that sounds familiar.
Right.
But I can't possibly piece together the whole sentence.
Exactly. So you get things like, that was good kinning.
Yeah.
In Beowulf, and you're kind of like, oh, I
sounds...
sort of understand that. It's almost English, yeah. But other times it's like, no idea. We do get another example of the Stoors just being different, right? Recall that they didn't go with the Half-Foots and the Fallowhides. Some of them ended up in Dunland and adopted a language similar to that one before they came to the Shire, which didn't happen until 1630.
Right. It's about 30 years after the other ones did. By the way, shout out to Lord of the Rings Online for touching on this idea of Stoors or Stoor descendants being in Dunland. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
Yet another brilliant thing they do to tip the hat to this sort of thing. Yeah. In the much longer discussion of the hobbits in F2, featured in Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien added a few things. Initially, he wrote that no tradition, however, remains of any difference of speech between the three kinds of hobbits. But then he struck that out.
Yeah, he's like, no, there's got to be something. We also get more on this notion that they never had a language of their own. He wrote, they had, of course, many words and usages peculiar to themselves, but the same could be said of any other folk that used the Westron as a native tongue. It is true that none of the legends of hobbits refer to times earlier than some centuries after the beginning of the Third Age, while their actual records did not begin until after the Western hobbits had settled down, somewhere about Third Age 1300, and had then long adopted the common speech. Yet it remains remarkable that in all such traditions, if any tongue other than the common speech is mentioned, it is assumed that hobbits spoke the language of men among whom or near whom they dwelt.
He also offers an explanation of this, quote, remarkable fact. Among hobbits now, there are two opinions. Some hold that originally they had a language peculiar to themselves. Others assert that from the beginning they spoke mannish tongues, being in fact a branch of the race of men. But in any case, it is agreed that after migration to Eriador, they soon adopted the Westron under the influence of the Dunedain. The first opinion is now favoured by hobbits because of the growing distaste for men, but there is in fact no trace to be discovered of any special hobbit language in antiquity.
I love that. The first opinion is now favored by hobbits because they don't like us anymore. Now, in a footnote, he even adds that this first, obviously incorrect belief that they did have a peculiar language was supported, as it appears to them to be, by the fact that among themselves they speak now a private language, though this is probably only a descendant, the last to survive, of the old common speech. So much more in F2 as he explains that the speed with which they adopted Westron was because their old language was just about the same as that of the Eotheod, and it was kin to the languages of Dale and Esgaroth.
He even adds this interesting paragraph. An example of this is provided by the name Stur itself. It seems originally to have meant big, and though no such word is found in the common speech, it is usual in the language of Dale. The curious hobbit word matham, which has been mentioned, is clearly the same as the word marthum used in Rohan for a treasure or rich gift. The horn given at parting to Meriadoc by the Lady Eowyn was precisely a marthum. Again, smile or smile, as in S-M-I-L-E versus S-M-I-A-L in the Hobbit language, the word for an inhabited hole, especially one deep dug and with a long, narrow and often hidden entrance, seems related to the word smugl in Rohan, meaning a burrow, and more remotely to the name Smeagol and to Smaug, the name among men of the north for the dragon of the Lonely Mountain.
Love that. So smile related to, we've talked about this before, related to a burrow, which is also related to the Germanic word for digging or burrowing, which is why Smaug. I mean, it's just,
right.
It's all fantastic wordplay.
But notice that he does say that it makes clear Smaug is the name that the men of the north give the dragon,
which connects to the Germanic.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It explains why he has a name that's cognate with these other English words and old English, because
he's almost setting himself up for the dwarvish outer names.
Yes.
I mean, he really is. He's talking about the tongue of the men of the north, and that is very much a lead into that. So
exactly.
And he also ties it to Appendix D that we covered last episode, saying that the most remarkable of all these Hobbit words, found not in Westron but in the languages of Rohan and Dale, are actually the names of the months in the Hobbit calendar, just like we talked about last episode.
Yeah, and we talked about the fact that they're so conservative even in our language, right? The names of our days and months go back thousands of years, right? We still refer to Thor's Day, and we still refer to
I know, it's wild.
January and stuff like that, right? Not necessarily making the connection with why they got this name. So it makes sense that those words would be particularly conservative and not change over a long period of time. And in an example of how material that eventually found its way into the prologue on Hobbits was originally part of Appendix F, we read this. As soon as they had settled down, the Hobbits took to letters. These they learned, with many other matters, from the Dunedain, for the North Kingdom had not yet come to an end in Eriador at that time. The letters used by the Dunedain and learned and adopted by the Hobbits were those of the Noldoran or Feanorian alphabet. It was soon after the learning of letters, about Third Age 1300, that Hobbits began to set down and collect the considerable store of tales and legends and oral annals and genealogies that they already possessed. The law-loving Fallowhides played a chief part in this. The original documents had, of course, in Bilbo's time long been worn out or lost, but many of them had been much copied. When the Shire was colonised, about Third Age 1600, it is said that the leading families among the migrants took with them most of the writings then in existence.
I love that, the lore-loving Fallowhides, because, of course, the Fallowhides are the more elf-like strain of the Hobbits. We also get a mention of the Great Writ of Tuckborough that we talked about in the Tale of Years, the yellow skin in the draft here originally. And then we also get this fun little extra. In this way, it came about that the Hobbits of the Shire, especially in the great families such as Took, Old Buck, later Brandybuck, and Bolger, developed the habit strange and yet not unparalleled in our times, of giving names to their children derived not from their daily language, nor from fresh invention, but from books and legends. These, to the Hobbits' high-sounding names, were often in somewhat comic contrast with the more homely family names. Hobbits were, of course, fully aware of this contrast and amused by it.
Do you think this is another retcon?
I think it might be. I also think it's a dig at anybody he knows who's named their kids names that come from the old legends and books rather than current language.
It's true.
I love that though. I mean, I'm thinking the Hobbit, the high sounding name that I'm thinking of, the first one was Peregrine's father, Paladin Took.
Or even Peregrine. Even
Peregrine. But
even Peregrine.
Because I'm thinking Pippin is okay, but Peregrine. Yeah. But Peregrine, Paladin, Meriadoc.
Yeah, exactly.
These are all very highfalutin, fancy names.
Yeah.
They're not Bilbo. They're not Sam. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love how he's able to do that, even though all of those names, of course, are translated.
Right.
Because none of those are actual Westron. Those are English representations of Westron names, as we'll get to next week. Yeah.
Yep.
Good stuff. Well, James, we'll see this very interesting thing that Tolkien broke down these next races in a unique order. Not quite sure why he did, but I'm going to have you read about the languages of the Ents and Orcs.
Okay. Of other races, Ents. The most ancient people surviving in the Third Age were the Onodrim, or Enud. Ent was the form of their name in the language of Rohan. They were known to the Eldar in ancient days, and to the Eldar indeed, the Ents ascribed not their own language, but the desire for speech. The language that they had made was unlike all others, slow, sonorous, agglomerated, repetitive, indeed long-winded, formed of a multiplicity of vowel shades and distinctions of tone and quality, which even the lawmasters of the Eldar had not attempted to represent in writing.
I'm just picturing Pengoloð being like, forget it.
Exactly.
I can't do this.
They used it only among themselves, but they had no need to keep it secret, for no others could learn it. Kind of helpful. Ents were, however, themselves skilled in tongues, learning them swiftly and never forgetting them, but they preferred the languages of the Eldar and loved best the ancient High Elven tongue. The strange words and names that the Hobbits record as used by Treebeard and other Ents are thus Elvish or fragments of the Elf speech strung together in Ent fashion. Some are Quenya, as Tauralim Momea, Tumbalem Morna, Tumbale Taurea, Lomeanor, which may be rendered forest many shadowed deep valley black, deep valley forested gloomy land, and by which Treebeard meant more or less there is a black shadow in the deep dales of the forest. Some are Sindarin, as Fangorn, beard of tree, or Fimberthrill, slender beech. Orcs and the black speech. Orc is the form of the name that other races had for this foul people, as it was in the language of Rohan. In Sindarin, it was Orch. Related, no doubt, was the word Uruk of the black speech, though this was applied as a rule only to the great soldier orcs that at this time issued from Mordor and Isengard. The lesser kinds were called, especially by the Urukai, Snugger, or slave. The orcs were first bred by the dark power of the north in the elder days. It is said that they had no language of their own, but took what they could of other tongues and perverted it to their own liking. Yet they made only brutal jargons, scarcely sufficient even for their own needs, unless it were for curses and abuse. And these creatures, being filled with malice, hating even their own kind, quickly developed as many barbarous dialects as there were groups or settlements of their race, so that their orcish speech was of little use to them in intercourse between different tribes. So it was that in the Third Age, orcs used for communication between breed and breed the Westron tongue, and many indeed of the older tribes, such as those that still lingered in the north and in the Misty Mountains, had long used the Westron as their native language, though in such a fashion as to make it hardly less unlovely than Orcish. In this jargon, Tark, man of Gondor, was a debased form of Tarkiel, a Quenya word used in Westron for one of Númenorian descent. It is said that the black speech was devised by Sauron in the Dark Years, and that he had desired to make it the language of all those who served him, but he failed in that purpose.
You wanted to make a lingua franca. You wanted to make an administrative tongue. You did not succeed. All right. Let's go ahead and look at the tongues of other races. And again, I thought it was interesting that Tolkien chose to bracket the section with two good races. We got the Ents leading it off and the Dwarves ending it, but we put the Orcs and Trolls in the middle. Because in F2, he discussed the Dwarven speech first, then that of the Orcs, followed by the Trolls, and the Ents don't even get a mention. And the fact that the Ents don't get a mention might suggest an even earlier writing of F1 and F2, right? We've already discussed they can't be later than 1950. Christopher Tolkien's demonstrated that because of his use of the lingerers thing.
Yep.
But Tolkien himself would say that the creation of the Ents happened spontaneously during his writing of the Treebeard chapter. This is in one of his letters. Thus, though I knew for years that Frodo would run into a tree adventure somewhere far down the great river, I have no recollection of inventing Ents. I came at last to the point and wrote the Treebeard chapter without any recollection of any previous thought, just as it now is. And then I saw that, of course, it had not happened to Frodo at all. Now, he wrote the Treebeard chapter in 1942, and I know I'm sort of arguing by the absence of evidence, but it seems to me that it's possible, at least, that F1 and F2 were even written before 1942, before he'd even come up with the idea of Ents. I don't know. Just throwing that out there as a possibility. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that he had come up with Ents and just decided not to include them in the language discussion because there wasn't much to say.
Or maybe he hadn't developed the Entish language in any way. To know how
to the extent that it even exists. I mean, the bits of so-called Entish that we get, as we're told here, are actually just Quenya.
Yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, I'm just going to tell you, I'm terribly jealous. I almost took this passage just because I wanted to say those Quenya words, that lovely, the one that's translated into the new land at Disneyland. It's between Tomorrowland and Frontierland. It's called Forest Mini Shadow, Deep Valley Black, Deep Valley Forest, and Gloomy Land. The rides there are fantastic, but you can only get on if you can say it in Quenya.
The funny thing is, I just have to mention this. Of course, we're used to the Ents speaking very slowly.
But that's not what Tolkien did.
But if you listen to that recording of him saying that,
it's fast.
It's extremely fast.
Yeah.
It almost shocks you.
It really did. I know. I was like, wait a minute now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of, Tauralim man tumbala. Yeah. It's that sort of pace.
He moves fast.
Not what you would expect from the Peter Jackson films. But anyway.
Or even from the way Tolkien describes the language as slow, sonorous, kind of ponderous, very. It would take me forever to say your name. Why? Right. You speak at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Yeah. No, Tolkien does.
Anyway, on to the language of the Ents as they're described in this passage. They're described as the most ancient people around in the Third Age, still around in the Third Age.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Alan?
I'm curious. Aren't the Elves older than the Ents, or are they? Right.
Well, it depends on how.
You have to look at the creation of the Ents. Did Yavanna's sort of, when she went to Manwë and said, "Hey, but Manwë, if you're going to have if Aule's people are going to be cutting down trees, I need some guardians of the forest. Can we do that?"
Right.
And he goes, "Yeah, I approve the project. Here's my signature.
Right.
Let's go ahead and we'll have the buyer order some."
Although isn't that notably one of the more Christopher invented passages in the Silmarillion?
Yeah, it is. So I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting that we're told the name Ent it's funny that Tolkien himself here says, right, that the name Ent is their name in the language of Rohan.
Mm-hmm.
But of course he means it's an Old English word that is representing the language of. So Tolkien's making that same shortcut that I'm trying to avoid us making, right? It's not Rohirric, it's Rohirric representative.
Right.
The Eldar call them the Onodrim or Enud. The Ents themselves credit the Elves, not for their language, but for their desire to speak, the creation of language, which is interesting. And that language, the Ent language, was very unique, impossible to replicate in writing. As you said, Pengoloð probably just gave up.
Threw up his hands like, I can't, no.
I can't do this. Impossible for a non-Ent to learn.
Yeah.
But fortunately, they could learn and remember other languages easily, right? So you can imagine them each with Duolingo on their phones. They were like,
They're learning languages left, right, and center. They loved Quenya the most, and that's why many of the words that we read that are spoken by them are Quenya. or at least Sindarin. Though a footnote here does tell us that at times the hobbits tried to write down actual Entish speech. And Tolkien gives us one example. "Alalala rumba kamanda lindor burme" also is not Elvish and is the only extant, probably very inaccurate attempt to represent a fragment of actual Entish.
And Entish is very heavy with compound words.
Oh, yeah. Right. As we learned earlier, right? With this,
right.
that forest mini shadow, deep valley black. I mean, just
right.
what?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah. They say to the Germans, hold my beer. Yeah.
They definitely do.
The names are mostly Sindarin, including Treebeard and his wife, though those are certainly not their Entish names for one another.
No, they're Entish names for each other about an hour long.
Right.
Which makes, pillow talk a little awkward, I'm sure. Anyway, we get to orcs and their language, what there is of it. First, we're reminded that orc is the name of these creatures, again, in Rohirric or Rohirric representative.
Yeah.
Because it is Old English.
An Old English name, yeah.
It's very much an Old English word, as we'll get to. It's orc in Sindarin. It's orco in Quenya, urku in Adunaic, orca or possibly orc in Westron, uruk in Black speech, rooks in Kuzdul, and gorgun in the language of the Druidine, though that's likely the plural.
In letter 144, Tolkien writes that the word, as far as I'm concerned, actually derived from Old English orc,
Bingo.
demon.
Yeah.
But only because of its phonetic suitability.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, he just liked the sound
It's
of
like
it.
the sound of it.
The meaning of it's irrelevant.
They're not demons, even though they're evil. Yeah.
Right. And we're told that while Uruk might be their name in the Black speech, that name was typically only given to the great soldier orcs, while the rest was simply Snaga, meaning slave.
We even see that in the text, right? That moment when Frodo and Sam are overhearing the argument between the great soldier orc and the sort of more like a tracker.
Yep.
The soldier orc calls him Snaga.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
We're also given a very brief reminder of their origin, orc origin, which we will not get into here. That is far too big a discussion. Before we're told that just like the hobbits, they never really had a language of their own. They just took from other languages.
Yeah. Still, they only created their own jargon filled with nothing but curses and abuse. And because orcs were so tribal in nature, and this is something I mentioned earlier, what little orcish language that came about was not of any use in talking with other orcs, right?
No.
Like we see in Rohan, with 3 different groups of orcs or goblins coming together. So they had to...
Like we saw earlier in the reading, so that their orcish speech was of little use to them in intercourse between different tribes. Right. Not that we want to imagine intercourse between different tribes of orcs. We're not going to talk about orc reproduction in any way, shape, or form. Instead, they too adopted the common speech, even if it was just as ugly as any native orcish might have been. And we are given one specific word, Tark, told that it means man of Gondor, but even that originated from a Quenya word.
And that takes us back to Book 6, Chapter 1, the Tower of Cirith Ungol. "That's enough from you," snarled Shagrat. "I had my orders. It was Gorbag started it, trying to pinch that pretty shirt. Will you put his back up, being so high and mighty? And he had more sense than you anyway. He told you more than once that the most dangerous of these spies was still loose, and you wouldn't listen. And you won't listen now. Gorbag was right, I tell you. There's a great fighter about, one of those bloody-handed elves, or one of the filthy Tarks. He's coming here, I tell you. You heard the bell. He's got past the watchers, and that's Tark's work. He's on the stairs, and until he's off them, I'm not going down. Not if you were a Nazgul, I wouldn't."
Well, I'm not so sure about that last part. We also learned that Sauron had tried his hand at some conlang, developing that unifying administrative language, but the effort failed. In the part that we skipped reading, we learn some of the words from the Black speech that did make it out into the wild, as it were, among the orcs. One of them was gosh, fire, for instance.
This language, of course, died at the end of the Second Age, some 3,000 years ago, and only the Nazgul still spoke it. But it became the language of Barad-dûr and Sauron's captains. Mm-hmm. Of course, the One Ring's inscription famously was in Black speech.
Though, as you rightly pointed out last week, the words were in Black speech, but that brings us back to the whole idea of the Feanorian letters being used in modes.
Right.
So the letters were Elvish letters, but representing Black speech.
Exactly. And we get one other representation of black speech pointed out, as the appendix references the curse of the Mordor orc, which was in a debased form used by the soldiers of the Dark Tower.
Of course, it was a debased form, but we cannot read the mention of the curse of the Mordor orc without reading the actual curse of the Mordor orc. So let's go back to Book 3, Chapter 3, the Uruk-hai. One of the orcs sitting near laughed and said something to a companion in their abominable tongue. "Rest while you can, little fool," he said then to Pippin in the common speech, which he made almost as hideous as his own language. "Rest while you can. We'll find a use of your legs before long. You'll wish you had got none before we get home." "If I had my way, you'd wish you were dead now," said the other. "I'd make you squeak, you miserable rat." He stooped over Pippin, bringing his yellow fangs close to his face. He had a black knife with a long, jagged blade in his hand. "Lie quiet, or I'll tickle you with this," he hissed. "Don't draw attention to yourself, or I may forget my orders. Curse the Isengarders. He passed into a long, angry speech in his own tongue that slowly died away into muttering and snarling.
Nicely done.
Thank you, sir.
You've said that curse before.
I have said that curse before. Just ask people on the freeway.
And this is where we get to dive into the notes on F2, where Christopher Tolkien references the even later drafts that otherwise were not published. He adds, "There is scarcely anything in the last text that call for special notice, but it should be recorded that in the penultimate draft, my father revealed the meaning of the sentence in the black speech uttered
Yes.
by one of the orcs who was guarding Pippin in the chapter, the Uruk-hai. Ugluk o bagronk sha pushtug saruman glob bushhosh sky." The translation, Ugluk to the cesspool, Shah, the dung filth, the great Saruman fool, sky.
The dung filth. Pushtug. And cesspool. I mean, of course this is how orcs are going to speak. It's fantastic. I absolutely love it.
Okay, enough about the orcs.
Yes.
Let's talk about trolls.
Sure, why not? Right? We're all on the internet every day. Oh, not those kind of trolls. All right.
Not those kind of trolls.
All right. Trolls. Troll has been used to translate the Sindarin Torog. In their beginning, far back in the twilight of the elder days, these were creatures of dull and lumpish nature and had no more language than beasts. I'm feeling called out by that passage, by the way. Dull and lumpish nature. All right. But Sauron had made use of them, teaching them what little they could learn and increasing their wits with wickedness. Trolls, therefore, took such language as they could master from the orcs, and in the Westlands, the stone trolls spoke a debased form of the common speech. But at the end of the Third Age, a troll race not before seen appeared in southern Mirkwood and in the mountain borders of Mordor. Olag Hai, they were called in the black speech. That Sauron bred them, none doubted, though from what stock was not known. Some held that they were not trolls, but giant orcs. But the Olag Hai were in fashion of body and mind quite unlike even the largest of orc kind, whom they far surpassed in size and power. Trolls they were, but filled with the evil will of their master, a fell race, strong, agile, fierce, and cunning, but harder than stone. Unlike the older race of the Twilight, they could endure the sun, so long as the will of Sauron held sway over them. They spoke little, and the only tongue that they knew was the black speech of Barad-dûr. Dwarves. The dwarves are a race apart. Of their strange beginning, and why they are both like and unlike elves and men, the Silmarillion tells. But of this tale the lesser elves of Middle-earth had no knowledge, while the tales of later men are confused with memories of other races. They are a tough, Thrawn race for the most part, secretive, laborious, retentive of the memory of injuries and of benefits, lovers of stone, of gems, of things that take shape into the hands of the craftsman, rather than things that live by their own life. But they are not evil by nature, and few ever serve the enemy of free will, whatever the tales of men may have alleged. For men of old lusted after their wealth and the work of their hands, and there has been enmity, between the races. But in the Third Age, close friendship still was found in many places between men and dwarves, and it was according to the nature of the dwarves that traveling and laboring and trading about the lands, as they did after the destruction of their ancient mansions, they should use the languages of men among whom they dwelt. Yet in secret, a secret which, unlike the elves, they did not willingly unlock even to their friends, they used their own strange tongue, changed little by the years, for it had become a tongue of lore rather than a cradle speech, and they tended it and guarded it as a treasure of the past. Few of other race have succeeded in learning it. In this history, it appears only in such place names as Gimli revealed to his companions, and in the battle cry which he uttered in the siege of the Hornburg. That, at least, was not secret, and had been heard on many a field since the world was young. Baruch Khazad! Khazad Aimenu! Axes of the dwarves are upon you! Gimli's own name, however, and the names of all his kin, are of northern Mannish origin. Their own secret and inner names, their true names, the dwarves have never revealed to anyone of alien race. Not even on their tombs do they inscribe them.
How convenient.
Oh, okay then.
Okay, so let's start with another of the evil races, the trolls. Here we're told the word is a translation of Torog, a Sindarin term. And it's interesting that while we don't learn more about their origins, we do learn that the trolls that were around in the First Age used no language and were no more able to do so than beasts.
Yeah, but they did have just enough intelligence for Sauron to teach them. And now I'm picturing them as like giant parrots learning how to emulate human speech. No, they did take language from the orcs, and it resulted in the debased form of the common speech that we see the trolls speak in The Hobbit. And this is, once again, another very interesting retcon. Like, why do the trolls that we encounter in The Lord of the Rings, the big vicious trolls, not speak? Why do they not speak common speech? But why do the trolls that we meet in The Hobbit talk like, these thugs that are, what's the deal? Have they devolved? No, we have two totally different groups. This group was just smart enough to borrow language from the orcs, and then we get a different story with these new ones, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. The Third Age trolls, the Olog High, they are a different story. And we even get insight into their creation. Even if we don't get clarity, we learn that Sauron bred them. The First Age trolls were created by Morgoth. Well, not created, but corrupted.
Right.
Treebeard says they were made in mockery events.
That's right.
But Sauron bred these Third Age ones.
But how he bred them, we don't know.
No.
Right. It's very unlikely that they were giant orcs. Simply, they far surpassed orcs in size and power. And in fact, the text tells us they were ordinary trolls, but filled with the evil will of Sauron. And that's pretty significant. Once again, Sauron pouring himself into his creation, just like he does with the ring. And it's only because he animates them that they can do the things that they do. That little bit about the will of Sauron, we see that in action when Barad-dûr is destroyed and the will of Sauron no longer functions. And these creatures are just like, I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. So, they're an elite force, right? But they're only able to speak the Black speak.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole section, though, is interesting because the second half of it, that part, especially about the Olog High, is once again like that bit about Galadriel and the sea longing, has nothing to do with language. It's about the origin and nature of trolls. And it's like, you're running out of space, but you're using it to tell us this stuff. I mean, I'm thankful, right? Because it gives us some more background, but why even include a section on the language of trolls other than just say, like the orcs, the trolls borrowed from common speech.
Right.
They never were smart enough to develop their own language. Move it on.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
Interestingly, in F2, we only get the part about the earlier trolls, which suggests again that the idea of the Olog High hadn't been fully developed by Tolkien at the time.
That's quite possible. 1950. Yeah. The idea of these sort of much stronger, even more boss-like trolls had not come about. And now we move on to the dwarves. And though Sarah and I talked about dwarves at length for 5 straight weeks, we didn't talk too much about their language. And it's mostly because we don't know a lot about their language.
And it's the same here. There's not much about their tongue. It's more about their nature and how they protected the secrecy of Khuzdur. Yeah. And we get the fact that they're a race apart. And we're told to, I find this fascinating, to look at the Silmarillion for their strange beginning.
Is this a remnant of when Tolkien thought he might get the Silmarillion published alongside it?
Yeah. It's fascinating. I have to go back and check actually if the first edition says that.
That's what I was wondering. That very thought popped into my head. Like, I wonder.
I will look that up. Another description of the race of dwarves in general: tough, ill-tempered, holding grudges, lovers of gems and other crafted things.
Yeah. But we do get this very interesting tidbit. Not only are they not evil by nature, few ever serve the enemy of free will, and it's men whose stories might suggest otherwise. That brings us back to the line in, is it of the Rings of Power in the Third Age? I can't remember now, where we learned that some of every race fought on both sides in the last alliance.
Yep.
Who wrote that? Is that a mannish history? Because if that's a mannish history, you have to call that into question now and say, yes, the plain reading of the text suggests that means that dwarves, though not of Durin's house, fought for Sauron.
Yep.
But this line suggests that's really unlikely.
Yeah.
And that men, if they wrote the story, have an ulterior motive, that there's been enmity between men and dwarves.
That's a good point.
And that's so interesting because this is also the first time and maybe the only time that we see a very clear point that there has been enmity between these two races.
Yes.
We know there's enmity between elves and dwarves.
Right.
I mean, Yavanna's like, your people and my people, we're not going to get along.
Yeah.
Or I mean, she's of course talking about the trees, but then it's Iluvatar who says there's going to be strife between the children of my adoption and the children of my choice.
Yep.
And we're going to have trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that it's the men's language that dwarves pick up in their work and travel and trade.
Especially if there's enmity, but I guess there's less enmity than there is with the
necessity
elves.
for trade. I mean, you see this all the time even now, right? That two groups of people that have enmity between them, if there's
they still need to exchange money.
Exactly. Yeah. Their own language, which we talked about, was not a speech taught to their children as infants, but was a tongue of law, was kept very tightly secret. And we're told that the place names mentioned by Gimli, the names of the mountains and so on, and the dwarven battle cry are the only words we get in the dwarven tongue.
Like the one that I've been mispronouncing all the time, the name of the mountain.
Bundushatur.
Bundushatur, not Bundushathur. Yeah. So we're reminded of what we talked about recently on a couple of occasions, the retcon, that dwarves don't tell anybody their dwarvish or inner names.
And in F2, the purpose for this retcon is clear. And I quote, "So it was that the northern dwarves, the people of Thorin and Dain, had names drawn from the northern language of the men of Dale, and their secret names are not known to us."
Thank you, Poetic Edda. Yeah. It just reminds me that all the way back in December of 1937, only 2 months after The Hobbit was published, Tolkien himself wrote, "I don't much approve of The Hobbit myself, preferring my own mythology, which is just touched on, with its consistent nomenclature and organized history, to this rabble of Eddaic-named dwarves out of Voluspa."
Exactly.
I love that. Like, I really, really wish I hadn't done that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Christopher removes all doubt that this forced his father's hand in this regard, because he says, but now this inescapable Norse element had to be accounted for.
Yep.
And from that, quote, rabble of Eddaic named dwarves out of the Voluspa, the conception emerged that the dwarves had outer names derived from the tongues of men with whom they had dealings, concealing their true names, which they kept altogether secret.
I love that. Absolutely. Tolkien thinking all the time about how to fit this in. Because, of course, when he wrote The Hobbit in 1937, like he says in that letter, he was just touching on his own mythology. He didn't picture it as being part of that mythology. It was a separate story. He had no idea who the necromancer was. I mean, yeah, you can see the connections, right? Anybody who's read,
he throws in a bunch, of stuff about the sundering of the elves.
I mean, you get the elves,
the fall of Gondolin, and
certainly. I was going to say Thingol, but I mean, Legolas's dad is basically Thingol. He's just not named that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's also one of the reasons why we get the question of, is the Arkenstone a Silmaril? No.
Yes.
But yes.
But he was
he was very much drawing on that.
Yeah,
exactly. As I've talked on that before, because Arkenstone comes from Eorkmanstan, which is, like a sacred stone, which is very much what the Silmarils are.
Absolutely.
But yeah, anyway, so he was drawing on it the whole time, but never intended to be part of. So when he has to go back and connect him, he's like, right? I mean, it ends up that the One Ring ends up being the thing, which is why he rewrites all of Chapter 5. But now it's like, I've got to fix this name problem because I've got this rabble of Edaic named dwarves. How? Why? Anyway. Barliman's own name, however, and the names of Bob and Nob are of Bree or Mannish origin. His own secret name, well, it was actually Barnabas until very late revisions, actually. Yes. It really was. But that won't be on his tomb either, James. What does Barnabas or Barliman have for us tonight?
Okay, Tom from Maryland writes, I know that Tolkien did a lot more work on the Elvish languages than we get in The Lord of the Rings. But what about the other languages? Did he develop things like Khuzdul or Adonaic much more? Which is a really interesting question. So I have some stuff to say about Adonaic, but before I get to that, I wanted to just look at the wonderful resource Eldamo and look to see how many words they have in different languages, just to get a sense of how developed the different languages were. And of course, there's this problem of what time period we talk about, because if you look at the early stuff, like the Gnomish lexicon and stuff like that, Eldamo lists like 3,299 Gnomish words or 3,893 early Quenya words, which reminds me of that wonderful Monty Python interview with a Shakespearean actor where you remember where Sir Edwin, after rattling off how many words he has to say in Hamlet and Othello, then gets asked how many words he has to say in King Lear. To which he responds, I don't want you to get the impression it's just a question of the number of words. I mean, getting them in the right order is just as important. But looking at the number of words, so in the sort of Lord of the Rings period of time and afterwards, Eldamo lists 2,676 Quenya words, 1,392 Sindarin words. Interestingly, 228 Telerin words. So Telerin we get actually a decent amount. But then you get things like Nandoran, 13 words. Vanyaran, 8 words. Avaran, 6 words.
Wow.
Right? So these are clearly not developed at all. Khuzdul, 39 words. Right? So it's not big at all.
No.
The actual number of Rohanese words we get, and by the way, when I'm counting words here, I'm not meaning names. I'm meaning just common words. The number of Rohanese words or Rohirric words that we get, other than names, is only 11.
Oh, wow.
But we do get 108 names. So Valaran, which, at one point in time, he conceived of the Valar speaking a different language, not just the earliest form of Elvish. 16. Talisker, one of the 2 words.
2
published so far. There's possibly other material, but I just want to and Westron, 55 words. The Dunlendings, we talked about it. Forgoil, 1 word, right? Yeah. But I do want to briefly say the Adonaic language, where Eldamo has 191 words of Adonaic that they give. But really interestingly, we have in the Notion Club papers this wonderful in volume 9 of History of Middle-earth. We get this wonderful little segment called Loudon's Report on the Adonaic Language.
Yeah.
And it gives actually some phonology, some morphological processes. It starts to discuss nouns. It doesn't get into verbs or other parts of speech, but it starts to give this detailed grammatical description of the Adonaic language, arguably clearer than anything he wrote about how the Elvish languages worked. What's unique about it, though, is this is the only time that I can think of where Tolkien invented a language once and didn't continue to revise it. So we actually get this beautifully clean one snapshot of this Adonaic language and how it worked that never got changed. It's in pristine condition, incomplete, but pristine condition.
Yeah.
So yes, Tolkien did, to answer Tom's original question, Tolkien did develop various languages, not nearly to the extent of Quenya and Sindarin, but certainly Adonaic he'd done a bunch of stuff with. Many of the others, not much, just a handful of words.
Well, folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Be sure to join us again next week as we conclude our 2-part exploration of Appendix F as we look at the details behind Tolkien's translation of all of these languages and get into that whole, Rohan representative, and we learn Frodo's real name and all that fun stuff.
Exactly. Alan and I want to thank the members of Team PPP, Editor Jordan Rennells, Barliman Becca Davis, Social Media Manager Casey Hilsey, Event and Patreon Community Coordinator Katie McKenna, Graphic Artist Megan Collins, and Website Guru Phil Dean.
Now, please take a minute to check out the prancingponypodcast.com. That's where you'll find show notes, outtakes, Prancing Pony Ponderings, and our online storefront where you can get PPP merch featuring all the great episode artwork that Megan's been doing for the PPP since the start of Season 7.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony podcast is, after all, a podcast about the books. So if you're interested in a book we've mentioned on the show, you'll find a link for it in our library. We do get a small amount of compensation when you make your purchase, and we thank you for that.
Indeed. And we also want to thank our patrons at the Círdan's contribution tier. I'll start with DeMay in Alaska, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Joseph in Michigan, Kathy from North Carolina, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, Erwin from the Netherlands, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Zaksu in Illinois, Sarah in New Jersey, Joshua in Massachusetts, Lucy in Texas, Keith in Alabama, Erica in Texas, Vivian in California, and James in Massachusetts.
There's also Anne in Kentucky, Sean in New Jersey, Mason in California, Maureen from Massachusetts, Olivia in London, Robert in Arizona, Nick in Wisconsin, Lewis in South Carolina, Thomas in Germany, Craig in California, Bailey in Texas, Kevin in Massachusetts, Julie in Washington, Bruce in California, Joe in Maryland, Nathan in Arizona, Kevin in Pennsylvania, Tom in Pennsylvania, and Jeff in Michigan. Thank you also very much for your support.
Indeed, thank you.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony podcast. Subscribe now through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your inner names, the ones you won't even have on your tombs, to barliament@theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you want your voice literally heard, well, just send us audio of your question. Visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us. Be sure to still email the question to Barliman, though.
Please do. Now, even though Barliman's been a lot more reliable lately, there is still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll try to get to you just as soon as we're able. As always, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time,
may you rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill.